Welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We've been watching the Middle East closely as the ceasefire in Gaza holds up. 3 hostages were released yesterday in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. This all comes as U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is kicking off his swing through the Middle East by visiting with top Israeli officials today. During the meetings, he endorsed Israel's war aims in Gaza, saying that Hamas, quote, must be eradicated. Of course, we've been following the fragility of the ceasefire deal in Gaza. Host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, still here. Hal, what is Rubio's chief goal with this visit?
You know, that's a very good question, Austin. Part of it is obviously it's diplomatic, meeting. This is a trip for, as a brand new Secretary of State, a trip for him to go to the Middle East to meet with Netanyahu personally, to meet with his staff, to meet his counterparts. A lot of this stuff is it's an important place. Obviously, there's big conflict involved. We're heavily involved there, so it's important. But there's also another side to this. Part of it was to publicly reinforce that there is no daylight between where the U.S. stands and where Israel stands, and particularly making it clear to certainly all the countries of the world, particularly the neighboring countries around Israel, but specifically making it clear to those involved in the ceasefire negotiations, either as interlocutors, such as Qataris, and of course the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the role that they're playing, but also specifically to Hamas, what's at stake here. What's interesting is Netanyahu, ever since this thing began, says, hey, look, Hamas is not going to be a governing authority. They're not going to be a military threat to Israel when this is all done, and making it pretty clear that Hamas was going to get wiped out in so many words. All right, that was pretty clear as an original goal. Now, during the last 15 months or so, there have been periods of daylight between the U.S. position and Netanyahu's position, and that is something that Hamas has always exploited. The moment they can see a little fissure between where the U.S. is and where Israel is, they move in quickly. They use the global information space. They engage in a lot of propaganda, information operations, everything they can to try and create as much of a gap as they can. The Trump administration has closed that gap using some pretty harsh rhetoric when, basically both Netanyahu and Rubio were saying that Israel will be able to, will potentially open the gates of hell. That's some pretty strong language. That's not what I call subtle diplomatic speak, but that's communicating in a very visceral way that if Hamas does not engage in this in a very serious way, that military operations will begin and could begin in a way that are much more devastating to Hamas, and frankly, probably more devastating to the Gaza Strip than what we've seen before. As hard as that is to believe,
right?
They would have to go in there, because if they cannot get the hostages free, which is the only leverage that Hamas has, that's it. They have nothing more than live hostages. If they will not release those hostages, if there's no way diplomatically to get them out, then Israel only has one other option. And basically, Rubio was there to make it very clear that we'll back that. By the way, this coincides with a couple of other things, if I can mention. We recently sent some of the very large 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. Those are ones that the Biden administration held back on. Why? Because they caused such phenomenal devastation. The statement of sending those bombs is that when we talk about the gates of hell, those are the bombs that open the gates of hell, if you will. Those things are just so huge, they destroy, like city blocks. That's how big they are in terms of that. So that was part of it. The other thing that was happening, a little bit more subtle, was the Egyptians, which are the lead on putting together the Arab counterproposal on what to do with Gaza. The Trump administration has a proposal out, which Netanyahu says sounds really good, where the U.S. takes ownership, if you will, of Gaza, moves out all the Palestinians in Gaza, and then rebuilds it. Obviously, that's caused a lot of consternation all over the place, and concerns about international law and some other things with that. But there's an Arab counterproposal, And a lot of this rhetoric is really putting pressure on Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and others to come up with a very substantive counterproposal on what to do. Interesting position that the Egyptians talked about today is that they're making it very clear to Hamas that in that reconstruction phase, in that recovery phase, if you will, which could go for years,
Three to
all right,
five,
after this
correct?
is done, that Hamas will not have a seat at the table. They will not have a role. I have to tell you, for Hamas, that is a very tough pill to swallow. That is kind of saying Egypt's telling them, we don't see you as being in a governance role after this is over either. And so Hamas is basically negotiating what many would consider the end of Hamas, and that's tough for them to deal with.
Yeah, Egypt's plan, I believe, said that they aim to rebuild Gaza within 3 to 5 years. Of course, that's subject to seeing how this all plays out. And that deal also, I believe, didn't involve anything with the United States. And there will be some grappling over who ultimately rebuilds Gaza, I have a feeling. Caleb, if we can we put that, the heavy bombs back on the screen? Because this is what Hal was talking about. Israel received a shipment of heavy Mk-84 bombs from the U.S. after President Trump lifted a block imposed on the munitions by the Biden administration. And let's move to that Truth Social post, because this is something that you and I have discussed at length, Hal. On Saturday, President Trump posted on social media, quote, Hamas just released 3 hostages from Gaza, including an American citizen. They seem to be in good shape. This differs from their statement last week that they would not release any hostages. Israel will now have to decide what they will do about the 12 o'clock today deadline imposed on the release of all hostages. The United States will back the decision they make. Again, posted that yesterday. So Hal, obviously that deadline has now passed. Nothing seems to have come of that 12 o'clock deadline. But what has Israel said about Trump's deadline?
Well, they basically they had the gates of hell discussion today, which was basically saying that look, they're very serious that they may go back into military operations. So it basically holds that sort of Damocles over Hamas' head if they don't keep doing what they're doing. But what they have actually done is they have gone back to dealing, basically with the phase one agreement. 3 Israeli hostages per week are released, and then a lot more Palestinians, phenomenally more Palestinians are released into the West Bank as a reciprocity. So they're going back to that, and there's also going to be some the remains of, I believe, 8 hostages are going to be released this coming week, which is the first time we've seen that in this particular phase, where they're releasing the remains of those hostages that died, were killed by the by Hamas. So that's part of what they're seeing. Now, this phase is going to end in about 2 weeks. And one of the things that there's been complaints about was that the Israelis had not sent a senior enough delegation to the phase 2 negotiations. And so the Israelis have basically signaled that they're going to send a more senior uh, team, if you will, to engage in those phase 2 negotiations. This is a very, very difficult phase. This is where Israel would withdraw forces from the Gaza Strip, particularly withdraw forces from that Philadelphia corridor, that border area between Egypt and the Gaza Strip that was permeated with tunnels. That's that primary smuggling corridor. And of course, the fear is that they pull out of that area, that all of a sudden Hamas is going to have a surge of weapons, ammunition, other stuff coming in, and they will be a resurgent terrorist, paramilitary, military force, and they're going to reconstitute during the phase 2 thing. And at the end of phase 2, they'll be back, not where they started from, but in a very, very difficult situation. So that's the Israeli concerns about phase 2. There has been some thought that the Israelis may counter by simply trying to extend the terms of the phase 1 negotiation while they work on phase 2, which would be the same sort of 3 hostages per week being released, and just continue that maybe for 2 weeks or maybe a month or something like that while they continue working on the phase 2. I frankly don't know where this is going to go. it's a big question. The U.S. One thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention: the U.S. and the Trump administration really pushed Netanyahu to agree to this ceasefire. All right, there's a lot of basically it's coming. It's pretty apparent that Netanyahu was not thrilled with this phase one agreement. He didn't want to do that, and that's primarily for internal political reasons. His coalition was threatened by agreeing to any ceasefire. He had a key member of his coalition, one of the parties, pulled out, and he's on basically thin ice in terms of being able to maintain that coalition that keeps him as prime minister, which is pretty important because he is also facing charges in court. And if he's not prime minister, he's going to have to go to court and deal with that, which could potentially end up in, if he's convicted, could end up in prison time. So he doesn't want to do that. He wants to stay in power as long as he can. So part of what you're seeing with Rubio's trip with this is that when they put pressure on Israel to do this stuff, but at the same time, this also comes back and it reinforces Netanyahu in Israel with the U.S. standing beside him, which helps him solidify support within his remaining coalition. There is a kind of a yin and yang thing going there, which is we're pushing him towards the negotiations, which he knows is politically perilous for him domestically in terms of domestic politics. On the other hand, we then follow up, and we have been following up with these public pronouncements and these trips in order to bolster him politically so that his coalition doesn't fall apart. It's a rather interesting dynamic that goes on there, but that's part of what you're seeing with the negotiations. That's part of what you're seeing today with Secretary Rubio in Israel.
We hope that substantive negotiations pick up about the phase 2 of the ceasefire deal that we expect would bring home eventually all of the hostages, and it would bring an end to this war. Hal, we'll keep up with you soon. Talk soon. By the way, the Strat podcast, new episode just recorded yesterday. Did it come out yesterday?
It did come out. It came out last night. Funny you should ask. And yes, and I'm talking really focused on Europe, talking about what happened this last week in Munich and elsewhere, talking about the war in Ukraine, but also talking about things tied to how funding could happen with Ukraine, talking about those rare earths in Ukraine, what the U.S. is trying to get some agreement on it with that, and also talking about the frozen Russian assets and what could potentially be done with that, and what the Europeans, the role they could play with that. So anyway, thanks for asking. But yes, it is out, and I would be remiss if I didn't say it's out on Apple, Captivate, Spotify, and YouTube.
Yeah, just about anywhere you can find podcasts. Hal, we'll talk soon.
Pretty much. All right. Thanks, Austin.